Okay. Right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you are. Welcome to the second webinar in this series. It's a joint effort between the Lutyens Trust America and the Lutyens Trust in the UK. My name is Martin Lutyens. I'm a great nephew of Sir Edwin, and I'm the co-chairman of the UK Lutyens Trust and chairman of the Lutyens Trust America. Our first webinar 2 weeks ago focused on a single Edwin Lutyens building, Goddard's, a house which we own in Surrey, about 30 miles south of London. And some of the Lutyens Trust America colleagues stayed there in October last year. Two of that group, eminent American architects, gave their impressions of the house on the last webinar and what it was like to live there. And I think everybody enjoyed it. Today we've got a broader canvas. We're looking at the life and legacy of Sir Edwin Lutyens. And our panelists are Robin Prater, who's on your screen now, and Jane Ridley, my cousin in London. Dr. Prater is a founder and executive director of the Lutyens Trust America, and she's both an architectural historian and a civil engineer. Her PhD was in architecture for Georgian Institute of Technology, and she has a master's in civil engineering as well. And her dissertation for her PhD was on the neo-Georgian architecture of Sir Edwin Lutyens. Our second panelist is Jane Ridley, the granddaughter of Edwin Lutyens and another of my cousins. She is I'm sorry?
Great-granddaughter.
Great-granddaughter of Sir Edwin Lutyens. I'll be corrected by the boss here. She's a historian, biographer, and broadcaster, and she's professor of modern history at the University of Buckingham in the UK. And there she is in charge of the master's course of biography. Jane also won a very notable literary prize, the Duff Cooper Prize in 2002 for The Architect and His Wife, which is her biography of her great-grandfather, Edwin. She's written biographies of many other notables, including Queen Victoria, King Edward VII, and currently is working on King George V. So you've got a very talented couple of panelists for you today. And one final point before I hand over to them is that the webinar today will be recorded and will be posted in due course on YouTube. So we thought you should be aware of that. So on that note, over to you, Robin and Jane.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay.
Thank you. Had to get my screen going. Let's see. Okay. So Edwin Lutyens was born just as the American Civil War was wrapping up, and he died toward the end of the Second World War. And that makes his career span a time of tremendous change in the world. And his architecture in many ways reflects that change, but in many other ways, there's a quality of timelessness that's characteristic of greatness, and that's why he's worth looking at. Throughout the course of his remarkably prolific career, he designed over 800 objects, some of them huge monumental buildings and some as small as an altar cross. And so we wanted to start with this beautiful Capriccio by Carl Logan. He picked 149 out of those 800 works and drew them all to scale. And so you can see the vast array of styles and size and usage. So it's an amazing picture of what his career was.
It's wonderful, isn't it, Robin? And I think that Lutyens would have loved it. It's a great.
I think so too.
Testament to him.
I believe Carl got the Henry Hope Reed Award last year for this, partly.
Oh.
So this is one reason we started talking was that if you pick up an architectural history book, a survey book, you probably see maybe 2 pictures of what Lutyens has done out of 800. And so one of them would probably be one of his arts and crafts houses, and the other one might be the Rashtrapati Bhavan or the Viceroy's house, which is up here on the left. So we just thought we would give an overview today of some of his works, and we're not going to go chronologically. We're going to go by style and by type. So that's why we may jump around a little bit. But just to orient you, this in the center is the Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral that we just passed. We'll be ending up the webinar with that. This down at the bottom left is the memorial to the missing of the Somme. The top left is Viceroy's house. This is Lindisfarne Castle up here on the top right. And then for the Americans in the group, this is the British Embassy in Washington.
Very small.
Yes, compared to the cathedral, everything is.
Yeah.
So we're going to start with the arts and crafts houses. And since we did Goddard's last week with or a couple weeks ago with our webinar, we thought we'd start there. A lot of people only know Lutyens as a arts and craft architect. And after we did our Lutyens intensive tour and stayed at Goddard's last year, a couple of the architects said, you know, if he never did anything other than the arts and crafts houses, he would have still been a great architect. They were that impressed. And at the heart of the arts and craft movement is a appreciation for fidelity to place and local use of local building materials, fundamental planning along with natural ornament that comes out of the construction process, and hand craftsmanship. So typically the arts and crafts houses are asymmetric, rambling cottages with deeply pitched, encompassing roofs and myriad towering chimneys. Although you can see by the time he did Goddard's, Lutyens had begun to experiment a little bit with symmetry. And this is Munstead Wood. This is probably Lutyens' best known house, would you say, for the arts and crafts?
It's a slide moving on.
Yes, did it?
Oh, yes, right, okay.
Okay. This definitely established Lutyens' reputation as a major architect. And the house shows his ability to integrate the house with the garden. In fact, the garden was started before the architect was found that was perfect for this house. Jane, you want to talk a little bit about the two women that came into Lutyens' life about this time?
This is a sort of iconic, to use a terrible word, house, isn't it? But I think it's a wonderful house with those sweeping low roofs and those very strong horizontal bangs of the windows. And of course, Lutyens built this house for Gertrude Jekyll. And she was much older than him, and she had already created the garden, and she wanted a house, and she knew exactly what she wanted the house to be. And so Lutyens was building this under her direction, and it's a really important house for his career because it launches him as a young arts and crafts architect. And after this house, really, what people in Surrey, where this was built and roundabout in the south of England, wanted was a Lutyens house and a Jekyll garden. It became a really important double act.
And in one of our next webinars coming up, we're going to do a webinar specifically on Lutyens and Jekyll. So look for that in the coming weeks.
I think the other thing we could just say very quickly while we're looking at these early houses is how incredibly prolific and kind of fertile of invention Lutyens was as a young man. This house here, it was built in 1897, and he was only 28. And in his sort of early 30s, there's a great flurry of really sort of pioneering, imaginative arts and crafts houses, which he built in a sort of fever of work. And one of the reasons for this was he was getting married to rather an expensive wife, Emily Lytton, and he wanted to keep her in the style that he thought she was accustomed. And so he was desperate for work. And it is extraordinary, the creativity, I think.
I think so too. So he met Emily, and then he met Gertrude Jekyll, not 2 years different. So that's amazing. So we started talking about all the different arts and crafts houses we could look at, and orchards and marsh court and so many others, but we decided today to limit ourselves to 3. And this is Deanery Gardens, and it's been described as a perfect architectural sonnet. The site was on an orchard in the middle of Sonning, surrounded by an old brick wall, and so Lutyens designed a house with this complex of roofs and chimneys that peeked over the wall, kind of like we saw at Goddard's on our last webinar. And then the house itself opens up into this beautiful garden. You can see the double oriel window there is, it tells you where the two-story grand hall inside the house is, but it's one of the many ways in which Lutyens connected the interior to the exterior landscaping. And you notice on this picture, the right between this wonderful window and then the towering chimney is the entry in and out of the house. So that's the connection between house and garden. And then you have a choice of coming down these beautiful steps or going across the bridge where you see the two people standing. So it's a beautiful thing. This may be one of the better collaborations or one of the best collaborations between Gertrude Jekyll and Edwin Lutyens. The garden that they came up with was just amazing. And it was a perfect setting for the owner of the house.
And the owner of the house, the patron who commissioned the client, who commissioned his house, was Edward Hudson. And Edward Hudson was the founding editor of Country Life. And Country Life was the first sort of major magazine, which was actually a magazine dedicated to writing journalism about houses, country houses, old and new. And we're going to see more of the collaboration between Hudson and Lutyens, more Lutyens houses commissioned by Hudson later on in this talk. But this was the first of them, and it is a wonderfully pretty house, isn't it? I love the rills, and it's called, of irises in the front.
Do too, and I saw a photograph. I don't have it here from this one, but Lutyens designed a windmill, a weather vane, for the top of the house. And there was apparently, he'd heard a story about a local dean that preached extremely boring sermons. So the weather vane shows him preaching and then empty seats. He preached so long and so hard that everybody left. So he's being funny even at the early ages. I like that Lutyens never copies. He's always interested in history and what came before him, but then he takes it in a different direction and often adds his own particular form of architectural wit, not just the weather vanes. This is what sets Lutyens apart too, is his planning. We'll have a webinar on that as well. But the way he related his architecture to the site is extraordinary. And he's going to carry this through to all aspects. His planning and his relationship of site, all of his architecture reflects that no matter what style he's working in. So now we're going to take a big jump architecturally and look at the Viceroy's house, or now it's Rastapati Bhavan. This is the opposite end of the architecture as far as scale and grandeur. And maybe that's why the architecture books usually print these two with an arts and crafts house, trying to show you the scope of his career. This shows an architect that is mastered his craft and has designed a monumental building worthy of great respect. Lutyens started planning Delhi before the start of the First World War, and then he refined his designs throughout the course of the war. He combined elements of classicism but adapted to India as part of his respect for fidelity of place. There's no detail of this building was too small for Lutyens to look at. He did not only design the building and the gardens, but he did the furniture, he did the fire backs, he did the lighting, the clocks. He even did a screen that has bird cages in it to entertain the children in the nursery wing. So his fingerprints are all over this building from the greatest to the smallest.
This was the building that he'd always longed to design. This was, it's a massive palace. And this was, in a sense, his sort of, his masterpiece, his life's work. And it's extraordinary, I agree, Robin, the way in which, down to every single door handle, everything is designed specifically for this wonderful palace. And I think it's also wonderful, as you say, the way in which he integrates East and West, and the way in which he provides a genuine and extraordinary synthesis of Western classicism and Indian architecture.
Absolutely.
Most of them.
But if we look at the arts and craft houses and then the work at Delhi, that leaves out huge portions of his body of work. Most notably might be his memorials. With the end of the First World War, Lutyens served as a pivotal member of the Imperial War Graves Commission, designing numerous memorials and cemeteries for the government, as well as so many private memorials for the sons of his friends and clients that never made it back from the battlefield. Two of the best known of these memorials are probably the cenotaph and the memorial to the missing of the Somme in Thiepval, France. If I happen to run into somebody from the UK that doesn't know exactly who Lutyens is, all I have to do is mention the cenotaph, and then it all falls together. Gavin Stamp probably said it the best. He said, from the moment the cenotaph was unveiled in its initial temporary manifestation, it seemed perfectly to express the grief of a mourning nation, and was indeed judged perfect in form.
Yes, I so agree with that. And I think that there's a really extraordinary sense in which the cenotaph was sort of created by the people of Britain, because it was originally intended to be a temporary structure. It was made of wood for a victory parade in 1919, and then it was made into it was so popular, and there were so many sort of wreaths and flowers found on it morning after morning, that a decision was made to make it a permanent structure out of stone. So this was in response to the public support for the initial temporary structure.
That's right. It's much beloved. It's still used today for Remembrance Day every November. And just one last comment. It looks like a perfectly rectilinear structure, but yet there's not a single straight line in the whole thing. The horizontal surfaces were designed as an arc of a circle that would have its center 900 feet below the center of the Earth's surface. And then the vertical surfaces tapered so they would meet about 1,000 feet above the ground. And it took 33 pages of manuscript calculations to figure this out. So it really makes you appreciate our computers today. So this is the memorial to the missing of the Somme. This is vast, complex, awesome. That's some of the adjectives used to describe it. Arguably the greatest work of British architecture in the last century. This commemorates over 72,000 missing after the Battle of the Somme. That's not missing and dead and buried, but dead and missing. Lutyens had an amazing ability to think three-dimensionally, and the architects in the audience can tell you that's a rare gift. And in this case, he envisioned intersecting and connecting a series of triumphal arches, making it something that was originally almost 2D, something three-dimensional. And the 16 pillars that ended up at the bottom then gave him a canvas that was large enough to carve all the required names of the dead. And Jane, you mentioned that
yes, that I think it's interesting that this idea of commemorating the dead or missing by carving their names into stone. This idea was an inspiration for Maya Lin with her Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington in 1982. So it's a really interesting way in which Lutyens' influence sort of reverberates.
Lutyens, his war memorials show that he could really strip down all the elements of classical architecture just to the bare bones. I mean, all the proportions are there, but it's in a very different and modern way. And I think it's a fascinating and very moving memorial. And while we're talking about the war memorials in France, we thought we might as well mention Lutyens' work at Le Bois de Montier. This was completed well before the start of the First World War, but it's an interesting example of Lutyens experimenting with the Art Nouveau, probably in the vein of the Glasgow School and Mackintosh, but he's also marrying it with the arts and crafts principles. And this is the back, and then Jane has an interesting story about.
Well, yes, because the clients for this house were, it was a banker called Mallet, and Madame Mallet was very involved with the religious sect called the Theosophy. And if you look at the back of the house, there's a very tall window, an oriel window on the right, and that inside that there's a beautiful hall. And inside that hall, Emily Lutyens, who went to stay in this house, found a locked door to a cupboard. And inside the cupboard were the religious books of Theosophy. And it was through reading those books that Emily became deeply involved in Theosophy, which was a development which her husband didn't exactly welcome. Because there were all sorts of ideas in Theosophy, such as reincarnation and attempt to synthesis of East and West, that he found very hard to accept.
So where do we go from here?
Well, we've looked at the arts and crafts houses. We've looked briefly at New Delhi. We've looked at war memorials. We've looked at a small amount of Art Nouveau. So what else is there for us to do?
Well, we haven't looked at my favorites, which are all the neo-Georgian houses he did. So we'll take a minute and do that. I have to tell you, I fell in love with Lutyens over the Salutation. This is a little house he did in Kent.
Little.
It is little. It's for three brothers, and each facade of the house is different. And it looks very simple, and yet when you look at it, it's a very complex with the proportioning and with the way the exterior relates to the plan and to the garden, and it's just a fascinating, beautiful piece of architecture. But Lutyens' appreciation for the vernacular started with his arts and craft work, and arguably he just considered that the Georgian work that came before him was just another form of English vernacular that he could choose from. And that's where he began experimenting with his Neo-Georgian. This Folly Farm is an interesting example of him using the Neo-Georgian with the vernacular. This may be what most people are familiar with if they have seen a picture of Folly Farm. He's got this amazing pool that just laps right up to this heavily buttressed and encompassing roof vernacular wing of Folly Farm. But this is my favorite part of Folly Farm, which is the Georgian, Neo-Georgian, or the Renaissance part. And you would think that chronologically in history, this came later, so this would have been the second wing or the later wing of the two. But in reality, this is the earlier wing. So he put the two together in a very interesting way, something Lutyens likes to do. He almost never puts his additions in the same style. And in this case, you have to know, it's like an inside joke with the house to know that the Georgian wing came before the vernacular wing. So it's always fascinating. The rambling and the asymmetrical arts and crafts work doesn't really transition well to a busy city street. And so that's another place that the Georgian architecture came in handy. This is the Country Life building. This is one of Lutyens' first urban commissions, and it's one of the early examples of what he called his Renaissance architecture. Renaissance in this case with a W, indicating that there's a debt to Christopher Wren, who was one of Lutyens' big heroes.
And there's also a big debt to Edward Hudson.
Yes.
Because this house was commissioned for Country Life, as Robin said. And Country Life had become a really important influence on Lutyens' career, in the sense that Hudson, from 1900 onwards, runs a whole sort of series of huge double-spread articles with wonderful, wonderful photographs of Lutyens' houses. And this is, you know, no architect could dream of better PR than this, better marketing, especially as, you know, it all came for free. So it's through Country Life that Lutyens' reputation and his work is projected to a wider audience. And also, of course, this brings new clients. People want a house like that.
Absolutely. And I believe Hudson met Lutyens through Jekyll. So it's another connection.
Yes, that's true. That's right. Yeah.
So this is another one of the Renaissance works. This is at the Institute at Hampstead Garden suburb. And Lutyens has designed a very complex facade, and he emphasizes some of the complexities with the different colors of brick. If you look, there's kind of implied pilasters and oversized keystones, and it's really an exercise in mannerism that's fascinating. And Martin, you were saying there's a connection between his work at Hampstead Garden suburb and the later work at Delhi?
Yes, I think it's probably true to say that this was his first opportunity to demonstrate what he could do in a sort of creating an urban setting. And the building on the top left there, the Institute, is the main building. And behind the camera on this side of it, there is a church. And on the other side, symmetrical with it, is another church. And the composition together creates something, maybe a little bit imaginative, but I see it as a forerunner to what he did in Delhi with Rashtrapati Bhavan as the great palace in the middle, and then the secretariat buildings represented by where the churches are in this composition here. I promised to send you an aerial photograph of this demonstrating what I'm talking about, but I'm afraid I couldn't find it in the time available. Sorry about that, but
no
that's
problem.
what I was getting at.
So at the same time that Lutyens was working with his Renaissance Neo-Georgian, he also was working on a stripped down kind of Neo-Georgian. And this is today it's the Bloomsbury Hotel in London, but it was designed to be the YWCA Central Club for young women. And I've always appreciated that he gave them a very stripped down facade, but then he gave them this very elegant entryway. He's even, if you look close, there's a crest at the top that says YWCA. So he's made it quite impressive. Around the turn of the century, 1905, 1904, something like that, Lutyens started to turn toward what he called the high game of architecture. He wrote letters to his friend Herbert Baker about it. And this is classicism. Heathcote is probably his first major expression of classicism with a in the vein of Palladio or San Michele. And like Le Bois de Montier, it's a little bit of a one-off. He didn't do one exactly like this again, but he certainly had a fun putting this massive Doric order villa right in the middle of Yorkshire. And the client was thrilled. Emily, there's a letter, I believe, that Emily got from a friend that lived nearby, and she said, "Do you know the house?" And they said, "Know it? Why, it's a great sight of the neighborhood. Even Americans come to see it." Imagine. And they said what's that?
Lutyens was quite high-handed towards this client, Mr. Hemingway. And there is a story about Lutyens, before the house was built, had a meeting with Mr. Hemingway. And Mr. Hemingway said he wanted an oak staircase. And Lutyens said, "Oh, what a pity." And Mr. Hemingway went away and came back several months later. And when he came back, he saw an absolutely stonking marble staircase, marvelous, but not what he'd asked for. And he said, "Look, I wanted an oak staircase." And Lutyens said, "Yes, I know." And I said, "What a pity."
They got away with it. So, well, in the letter, they said, all the neighbors said how wise Hemingway was to put himself entirely in Lutyens' hands. So the neighbors must have liked the staircase. And just wanted to show you this quickly. If Lutyens began to experiment in classicism at Heathcote, he perfected it at Gladstone Hall. This is a beautiful classical building by Lutyens, also in Yorkshire. He used the classical style for many of his London buildings. Some of the commercial examples include, this is was originally Britannic House. It's on Finsbury Circle. It was the headquarters for the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which is now BP. And that's not who's there now, but it's been renovated by, I believe, Peter Inskep, and now renamed Lutyens House. But it's beautiful. Martin was pointing out that it's really a low horizontal building within a temple put on top of it. And this is the Ned now. This was originally built as the headquarters for the Midland Bank and Poultry. And Jane, you and I were commenting how gorgeous the renovation has been.
By Soho House for the Ned. Yes, and I mean it's very nice that Lutyens' creation should be so much, you know, enjoyed and valued and esteemed by a whole new generation of people through its presentation as the Ned. I think it's excellent.
Yes,
the client for this building was McKenna, who was the head of the Midland Bank, and Lutyens, through that connection, built an awful lot of Midland Bank offices. But this is by, you know, this was the central, most important one, the headquarters of the Midland Bank near the Bank of England.
And this is on Fleet.
One little point about it. On this, sorry, go on. On the nearest corner,
yeah,
up high,
Right
you
here.
can see a statue, and there's another one similar to it on the other end. And they're a little boy, each of them, holding a goose. And you can just see the beak of the goose sticking out to the right. And this is Lutyens' little joke that the street was called Poultry. And here they have the statues with Poultry.
I'd never noticed that.
And this is the Reuters building. This is on Fleet Street, which at the time was where all the newspapers and the media would have been. But the photograph is not, this is not the camera. There's actually, you can see there's a batter to the walls. Lutyens did this in most of his commercial buildings in the city. And he also made the proportions of the window progressively smaller. So that makes the building look much taller and bigger than it actually was. And then he puts these overscale keystones and detailing that further makes you feel that it's a very important building. So we've talked about his residential, commercial, government, and memorials. That leaves out his castles. How many architects in the last century or two can say, well, yes, and I've got 3 castles in my repertoire. So here he took a former defensive fortress and turned it into a domestic setting. Home for Lutyens was always about refuge, with necessary components of security and strength and a sense of enclosure. And what a challenge to do that in this particular location. The exterior of this building is all about form and massing in a very modern way.
And the client for this building was, once again, Edward Hudson, who wanted to have a little holiday cottage on the North Sea, off the Northumbrian coast, nice and warm. So he bought this sort of ruin of a Tudor castle, and Lutyens was commissioned to create a wholly new castle, a new old castle on top of this bleak rock. And it is an astonishing building, I think, where it sort of totally integrated with the rock. You climb up the rock into the various walls of the fortress to reach the center of it. A great sense, as you say, of enclosure.
And Martin, he had a couple of very important guests to show this to, didn't he?
He did indeed. When he was there, he met the Prince of Wales and his wife, who later became George V and Queen Elizabeth. And that was important because it broke the ice for a later meeting when he had done his first drawings for the New Delhi Commission. And he was sent to see the king with his drawings. And instead of being strangers, they had already met here with Edward Hudson in this castle.
Very nice. And then we come to Castle Drogo. Castle Drogo was started about the same time as Delhi, and it finished up about the same time. If the romanticism and the drama and the domesticity at Lindisfarne would have served as a perfect resume to show that Lutyens was precisely the right architect to design the last castle in Britain. you can see the photograph of the hall on the left. There's connections in this building with the architecture at Delhi. And then on the top left, it's amazing how he took the heavy stone and just kind of dematerialized it as it comes up into those sharp fins, and the windows are progressively changed. I mean, his handling of materials is so deft on this. And
this took almost as long as New Delhi to build. It was begun before the war and not completed until the late 20s. And in the process, rather like Rashtrapati Bhavan, this castle was steadily reduced as Mr. Drew was horrified by Lutyens' initial plan, which was going to be so expensive. And even, I think, the final version was rather expensive. And perhaps exhausted a large part of the Drew fortune. But also, I think, what one of the sadnesses was that the son of the Drews, the only son and their sort of heir, was killed in the First World War. And this sort of must have made completing the house rather a sad project.
I think it was the oldest son, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. Oh, do they have other sons?
Yes. And Martin, you had a great story about the cartoon that Lutyens sketched.
The family, the Drew family, still live on the estate in another house. They have an apartment in the castle as well, but they have cartoons that Edwin Lutyens drew for his client Julius Drew, and he did this for many of his clients. And one of them is of this elevation of the castle at an earlier stage. And you may notice at the top there are two arrow slits. Well, in his drawing there is indeed an arrow slit, and down on the right-hand side of the picture, that as you look at it, there's a corpulent, dead gentleman in a check tweed suit with an arrow sticking out of him. And you can just picture Lutyens saying to Drew, "Look, you can have such fun up on the roof there. You can play cowboys and Indians or Norman soldiers and Saxons, and that's what you can pretend to be doing with the tourists." So there's this lovely cartoon, and
well,
the family
we hope nobody does that with our Lutyens intensive tour when we go to Devon next time.
Yeah, indeed. I'll make sure you see it.
So our story doesn't end with the castle. We're about to finish up, but time is short, so we're just going to touch on a few of the other categories that Lutyens worked in. He always wanted to do churches. And he was able to have the opportunity, as Martin said, to do 2 churches at the Hampstead Garden suburb. They framed one at each end of the central square that was also designed by Lutyens. This is the Free Church, and this is the St. Jude on the hill, and they face each other. You can see the architecture is very different, and the interiors are very different. They're really worth a see if you get a chance to see them. And of course, his largest church commission was Liverpool, and we'll finish up with that. But Lutyens also did bridges. This is the bridge at Hampton Court Palace, and Lutyens designed that, and he designed the lamp standards along with an engineer that he worked with. There's a great story about in Lutyens' first airplane ride in 1935, he got to fly over the Hampton Court Palace and this bridge, and then he wrote to Emily, his wife, "My bridge from the air looks ever so much better than any other." And then he says, "Why, I know, but I shan't write it, but it was odd." Now, don't we wish he had written it, you know? And then speaking of unusual or odd, perhaps his most unusual commission might have been to design a massive doll's house for Queen Mary. This took a number of years and a number of collaborators. There's everything inside is perfectly detailed. This picture on the right is actually one of the interiors. There's to scale furniture, there's working plumbing and lighting that you can see. There's to scale cars. There's a garden designed by Gertrude Jekyll. And there's this amazing library of tiny books, and they weren't just books with the names. The books of these famous authors all wrote inside the books. So you've got Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and G.K. Chesterton and Rudyard Kipling and myriad other people collaborated on this effort, even down to the fact that in the kitchen there's little tiny bags of flour and salt and everything you need.
It is extraordinary, isn't it, Queen Mary's Doll's House? It's just been restored. It's well worth looking at Windsor. And Lutyens had a slightly wicked sense of humour. Queen Mary used to come and play with the doll's house. The photograph you see there is in Lutyens' house in Mansfield Street. She came one time and she looked at the linen. There was sort of miniature linen for the bedrooms. And on her bed, there were pillowcases which were embroidered in tiny, tiny writing with initials MG on one and GM on the other. And so the Queen said, "What does that mean? Have you made a mistake? Why is one the other way around?" And Lutyens says, "No, ma'am. It stands for May George," that's the King, and then George May. If you see what I mean.
And then we couldn't talk about Lutyens without mentioning his furniture. This is when I run into an American that doesn't know about Lutyens, I usually say, you know, those curvy benches you see everywhere? Well, Lutyens designed that. And they're reproduced in all kinds of different proportions that aren't exactly right. But this one is by Candia Lutyens and the proportions are correct. So you can have a look at it. But his furniture is everything from tables to chairs to lighting to pianos. It's a vast repertoire, and we'll do a webinar on that in a couple of weeks as well. And you can't do a webinar out of the United States and not mention that Lutyens designed the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. This is a lovely building, and the photo only shows you just a small portion of it, but it's a beautiful building. And then lastly, we'll end with Lutyens' last largely unbuilt work, Liverpool Cathedral, and we're having our next webinar in 2 weeks. We'll focus on this amazing building.
And this building, well, it was never built beyond the crypt, but in his last years during the Second World War, when Lutyens was in London during the Blitz and getting ill and old, he spent all his time designing this amazing cathedral. And on his deathbed, he died surrounded by his drawings and plans of Liverpool Cathedral.
So you can see why we had so much difficulty choosing one image to represent this talk. No one building can represent Lutyens.
Right.
The only common element is the architect himself and his genius, and that which transcends time and place to provide continued inspiration to architects and designers today. So thank you so much for listening to this talk. And Martin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Well, Robin and Jane, that was a real tour de force. Thank you very much indeed. And how you've managed to condense 800 and something commissions into a talk like that is quite brilliant. And the choice of the buildings that you made is just perfect. The next webinar is I think, well, as Robin did mention, is I think on the 27th. We'll confirm the date anyway, and that will be on the correspondence between the architecture of the unbuilt Liverpool Cathedral, which you've just seen, and the Tiopa Memorial, about which Robin was talking. It's a very intriguing story of how Lutyens had these concepts that he was able to incorporate in different buildings. So that will be,
the next webinar is on May 21st, and will be, one of the questions I see was talking about the relationship between Tietville and Liverpool, which I believe our speaker will be doing.
Exactly.
Oh, well, let's talk on, yeah.
Okay, well, that's a very nice conclusion to the talk. Have we got time for questions?
Yeah, we have some time for some Q&A.
Okay.
Which maybe I could just read. Exposed brick masonry and high-pitched roofs with wood shingles on them and very decorative molding around the external architrave of windows and doors are salient features adopted by the esteemed architect through many of his signature projects. Did the bricks and shingles used weather all through these years?
The bricks that I've seen on the houses are in amazingly good shape. Now, there's always the enemy of every house is water. And so there's always some, water damage if they're not kept up exactly perfectly. But the bricks have held up quite well.
One of Lutyens' foibles as an architect, I think, was that he disliked drain pipes on the whole. And so that very often his, particularly that Hampstead church, actually, the Anglican church in Hampstead, has got really quite serious water damage because there was just a sort of spout hanging from a gutter. There was no down pipe. So this can be a little bit of a problem, I think. On aesthetic grounds, he disliked drain pipes.
Yes.
Okay, another question is, with the cenotaph, why was the ark 900 feet below the surface?
That was what Lutyens decided would be a pleasing dimension and proportion. He was in the same vein that the Parthenon doesn't have a single straight line. Lutyens was working kind of with his own monument, and that was where he decided it would be a pleasing.
I guess he probably got that particular dimension, as Robin says, from the ancients, the ancient art of entasis. And that's what his 32 pages of handwritten calculations would have been about.
Yeah.
So I'm going back up to the top. One of Lutyens' seminal works is the capital city of New Delhi. In context of the redevelopment of this area, what is your opinion on this? We touched upon it just before the webinar, but maybe you'd like to just reiterate.
I think Martin probably is the person on this.
All right. Well, I'm really not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but the first thing I'd say is that the Indian government probably cannot cope with the existing buildings from the point of view of the technology that needs to be in them these days, and a vastly increased number of legislators and bureaucrats. So one can sympathize with them wanting to do something. One would prefer that it was really sympathetic to Lutyens' work. And from what we've seen so far, that, to be frank, is not really the case. There's a huge debate raging in India about this at the moment, including there are economic difficulties, there are humanitarian difficulties caused by the kind of coronavirus, and there is an argument that the vast sums of money which it's intended to spend on the revamp, as it's called, of the Central Vista in Delhi could be better spent in coping with economic recovery and humanitarian crises. But as to the proposals themselves, I don't think it's appropriate for us to meddle with that.
But just another question about the Viceroy House. Does anybody know who did the watercolors? The watercolor rendering?
Are they what's called Cyril Ferry? The sketches that we saw, you mean?
Yes, correct.
I've got it, but if you'll send me an email, I'll send it to you. I'll double check it. I don't want to say for sure.
Okay, another question is it accurate that he designed a tombstone gravesite at Woodland Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, which was only recently discovered?
Yes, that's true.
Really?
Yes.
Who is it to?
That's why I'm always careful to say that the British Embassy is his only major work in the United States.
I didn't know that.
What's the oldest building Lutyens designed?
You mean the first building?
Yeah, let's say it's the first one.
Probably Crooksbury wouldn't.
It was a chicken house known as a fowl house.
And there's a cricket pavilion, isn't there, at that school in Surrey?
Was it at Reigate?
No. But there's lots of sort of early little bits.
Yes.
Well, the first thing he probably designed was he had ideas for how to fix his church in the town he grew up in Thursley. I don't believe it was ever done, but he had ideas.
I think it's the house that is generally cited as his first major house is called Crooksbury, and it's in Surrey, and the Lutyens Trust America group visited that on the October visit last year.
It was wonderful to get to see that. And it's a house that Lutyens worked on three different times. So to see the evolution of his art change was interesting.
So we've got two more questions. Let's see if we can finish these up. Even with his love of Wren, do you believe Lutyens enjoyed working in this more classical Georgian vernacular style, or was he responding to the whims of his clients and the times?
I think that the Georgian is what led him to the classical. I think that the Georgian, to his mind, was just another outgrowth of vernacular architecture, and so he was comfortable starting with it. And then I think once he got there, the Georgian proportioning and the form, I think, is what led him to fall in love with the classical. I think he enjoyed the challenge of the formality and symmetry that trying to marry that with the plan that he wanted to do. So I think there's a connection, definitely.
He really rated Wren. And I think a lot of people, architects at this time, didn't particularly think Wren was very interesting. But Lutyens, you know, throws himself into Wren's designs and is much influenced by him, I think.
Yes, and in some of his letters, he would say, you know, I think about what Wren would do in this case.
So should we, I know there's several questions, but let's just do one last one, which was, did Lutyens ever engage with smaller scale mass housing for people of modest means?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, the Westminster flats, aren't there? The checkerboard flats, black and white. It's all the building is coloured in like a chessboard. Flats in Westminster.
Yes,
Well,
and
he also did the timber frame houses that we got to go to. I was with the Lutyens Trust group a few years ago. Martin, you remember the?
Yes, those were more modest, and there is a village whose name, unfortunately, I can't remember, in Lancashire, in the northwest of England, which was to be a village designed by him, and only a small number of the houses in it were built. Other colleagues of mine would have it at their fingertips, but I can't remember its name.
You can
So,
look
yeah, more modern, more modest.
Hampstead Garden suburb was supposed to have, well, it did have some houses was supposed to be a middle class, working class community, and it did have some smaller houses, but nowadays they're not that cheap.
Right.
The Cedar Lodge is in the memorial books, if you want to look. That's one of his very small houses.
So I think that's all we've got time for on the Q&A front, and so there's a few questions that maybe we can answer in future webinars.
Okay, well, I'd just like to thank everybody who's tuned in for coming to join the webinar, and to thank very much the panelists. A couple of plugs, if I could, please. If you have enjoyed this webinar, and any of the ones that went before or come after, we'd very much like to have you as members, either of the Lutyens Trust in America, if that suits you best, or the Lutyens Trust in the UK, if you're over here. I've seen from the chat box here that there seem to be a lot of attendees from India as well, and it would be thrilling to have some of you who are not yet members join. I'd also add, somewhat in the same vein, one of our two sources of revenue is organizing tours and visits for people to see Lutyens' work in different countries and all over the world. And the current lockdown means that we're not able to do that, so this hits our revenues quite badly. And if you felt like making a donation, if you've enjoyed this talk, please do so. You can both join and donate on our respective websites. So thank you very much indeed to everybody for both performing the webinar and for attending it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.